do understand that you had a long tenure at the FSSAI. What are the top three things that come at top of your head? The key learnings of implementation of these kind of acts.
The first thing actually is that it amazes me always that at the policy level, we have not recognized that most of the health issues that the country faces, the rising burden of non-communicable diseases, unsafe drinking water, the issues of malnutrition, which includes undernutrition and overnutrition, all these are attributable to diet. And if we were to concentrate through policy measures on diet and eating safe and healthy, then we would reduce substantially the burden on the health system. So that's the first thing that strikes me, that certainly this is something that needs to be front and center for policymakers in this country, and there needs to be way more investment. The second issue really, which is something that we have to think about, is that we create a wonderful law, we make global science-based standards, but the enforcement across the states tends to be uneven, and therefore the impact that we could have is so much less. And perhaps the third, it's a challenge, it's also a concern, is that while we have expanded laboratory capacity immensely, nevertheless, the ability of labs to actually give consistent results on the same sample is something that we are still working at, and it's a long haul, particularly for some commodities.
During your tenure, that you visit the states, you interact with the key stakeholders, and you did see that, as you said, there are uneven implementation issues. So what are the kind of challenges that the states are facing to actually implement the guidelines in letter and spirit? Because and what are the states where you think it made a difference, and what were the driving forces in those states where it did well, and also in those states where it did not work?
I don't want to actually discriminate amongst the states. When we saw this, and let me say that the state visits were a piece of the entire initiative, which was actually to ensure that we got a more even quality of enforcement and implementation across the country. So there were multiple channels by which we attempted to do that. Number one, there were uniform standards, of course, but uniform lab requirements, they all had to be NABL accredited. Uniform testing protocols, this was one effort. The second effort was to incentivize states by a food safety index, states food safety index. And that really ranked the states, of course in different categories, union territories, small states and large states, on their compliance with various issues, HR issues, on laboratory accreditation, on the amount of the enforcement work they did, etc. So that was the second. And the third area was to do monthly reviews with all food safety commissioners. And the fourth, actually, was to back this up, because what I realized quite soon on was that the absence of state capacity required a political commitment. So the state visits were geared, of course, to review at the state level and interact with food safety officers and district officers, But also we took the opportunity in each state to call on chief ministers, on health ministers, and chief secretaries. That allowed us to do tremendous advocacy. And in some states, the response was really positive. I really don't want to talk about those states because things change. But I felt that this was a very important step for us all in encouraging states and also getting them some political backing.
When we have these statutory acts, I think it is people who make the difference at the ground level. So, what are the HR challenges both at the state and the center level where you felt that that needs to be further strengthened, and what were the kind of gaps which needs to be addressed so that the capacity of these officers across the spectrum of the level of officers need to be strengthened?
So, HR is an issue, as you rightly said, both at the center and the state. Fortunately, around 2018, we received the consent of the Health Ministry and the Finance Department to enhance our manpower strength. At the central level, we almost doubled the number of total technical staff that we could positions that we had. It took another year or so for us to get the recruitment rules in place, approved by everybody who had to approve it, and then start recruiting. So that was as far as the Food Authority itself was concerned. At the state level, the position is uneven. Some states have a full-time commissioner for food safety. I can count those on the fingers of maybe one hand. And in all the rest of the states, the food commissioner is somebody holding additional charge. He could be health secretary, he could be anything. He could be sales tax commissioner, but he is also holding charge of the food safety commissioner. So that is a big challenge. The number of district officers at the district level and food safety officers at the sub-district level, except for 2 or 3 states, that's UP, Tamil Nadu, maybe Gujarat, is way below the requirement and the norm. So during the state visits, this was a prime area of focus to suggest that the positions needed to be created and to suggest that we would support for an initial period some of the positions and to encourage states to move forward, and a lot of them did.
What were the initiatives, IT initiatives specifically, for the implementation of this act?
You've touched on a subject very close to my heart. I do think that the best way to unify a system is to use information technology. But having said that, it's a huge challenge to actually make it simple and easy. So the biggest and the one that I feel most happy about is the FOSCOS system, which is the food licensing and registration system. What we chose to do, we had several other softwares that were developed in parallel. One was the InfoNet for the laboratory that required us to watch from the sample to the testing to the results completely, and it had to be uploaded by each of our laboratories. We had an export system, export and import system, that too. We had the FOSTAC, which tracked the capacity building work, and the licensing and inspection system also. So the inspection was, of course, something called FOSCORE. So 5 basic software. What we did around 2020, we finally managed to get our software capacity and design right, and that was for the food licensing system. It was a big transition because we had been getting complaints. There was an existing FLRS system, but that often used to have bugs. It was very slow, and people who applied for licenses said This is barely an online system. So this was a strong, much stronger system. We put in payment gateways, so all the payments had to be done or could be done online. We got all the states on board for those online payments, and not to the treasury, but on this online system. And then we started linking up all the other software. And the reason for doing this is that as a regulator, I just don't want to have data on the licensee or the registrant. I also need to know what is the quality, when it was tested, what happened, what's the record of failure of samples, what are the issues in terms of inspections, what's their import or export performance, if any, how many of their staff is trained. You know, these are the kind of data you need. So unless you integrate all the systems, you're not able to build a profile of a particular organization and then monitor those which are of concern, and then do a much more light touch enforcement on those which have consistently performed well.
I think this would have made the system transparent even to the states. I think they would have really ensured that they use it and look at this data for improvements. Or was it only at the center level these kind of monitoring was being done?
Quite honestly, it takes a little bit of acceptability, if I may say so. There are people in the system who have been in the food safety from the PFA days. Some of the old designated officers or the food safety officers. And they are very reluctant to have this kind of, if I may say, oversight of their work. So it did take a lot of work and it did take a lot of pushing with the state governments to really get the system accepted. What was the biggest challenge was the inspection system. We put in a risk-based matrix. So a food safety officer was not entitled to go and visit any food establishment, but it was designed on the basis of low, high, and medium risk, and a certain periodicity for that inspection, unless you got a complaint or something of that nature. So that was required to be an online system, linked with the, what do you call it, geotagging, etc., that the inspection was taking place at a particular time and place. That had a very, very slow uptake. But let's see. I mean, the years ahead will show how well that's been accepted across the country. Wherever you create a system where somebody goes and inspects, industry finds it very burdensome. So this is a confidence building measure for industry and for food businesses. But also finally it allows the supervisory level to know exactly what is happening in their jurisdiction and to exercise real monitoring.
Ma'am, there is also a felt need by many of the states for food safety officers, when I interacted with them also, to take some feedback of what is it that they feel that is not currently there. So one of them actually shared that, the agriculture and feed testing is something that is currently not there, and also especially in terms of the pesticide residues in vegetables, the storage, improper storage related such kind of issues. Is it also planned that's beyond testing food final products, these kind of processes will also be part of the FSSI in due course?
This decision was provoked by several things, but the most important was we all read regularly reports in the newspapers and all these little videos which come on WhatsApp, etc., which are very skeptical about milk and milk products. And there is a perception that milk products are always adulterated, you cannot get pure milk, etc., etc. So the Food Safety Authority has over the years conducted a series of surveys, both on milk, but also on milk-based products, ghee and sweets, mawa, etc. So we did a very large milk survey in 2018-19, and what that indicated was actually there was no presence of urea, because frankly, if anybody looks at it, it's too. We have neem-coated urea in the country now, so there's no question of anybody using urea. But there was no other contaminant that was external, and the reason is milk is relatively cheap, and those so-called contaminants are expensive. But what we did observe was in fact, the largest contaminant observed was aflatoxin. Aflatoxin comes from the feed, from improper storage, those kind of issues. So we worked with NDDB to work with the farmers on developing the protocols and a standardized testing system for at each level of the milk processing by the organized sector dairies. So that has now come into force and it is in effect, and NDDB actually did a huge capacity building effort for that. But what it brought home to us was that through the agricultural practices, whether it is farming, where fertilizers are used and the crop is brought to the market before the cooling period, or whether in animal-based food products, antibiotic residues or contaminants like aflatoxin are seen, then we need to get back to the primary production level itself. And quite honestly, across the globe, this is the practice. It's normally food and feed. So the proposed amendment to the Act will propose to introduce feed also. We hope to use the machinery of the state agriculture department to actually lift the samples and also to leverage the laboratories they have. So it will be a sort of partnership, but the regulatory oversight will come from the Food Authority because they don't have an act to actually look at this.